The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned crisp and clear over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida adjusted his flight goggles as he led the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft toward the unsuspecting American naval base. Below, the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma rested peacefully alongside their sister ships, their crews beginning another routine Sunday morning. The tranquil waters of the harbor reflected the early sunlight, creating an almost picturesque scene that would soon transform into one of history's most devastating surprise attacks. Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on the balcony of his quarters, sipping coffee and reviewing intelligence reports that had arrived overnight. The documents contained fragments of intercepted Japanese communications, but nothing that suggested imminent danger to the Pacific Fleet. The prevailing wisdom in Washington suggested that if Japan were to strike, it would target British or Dutch territories in Southeast Asia, not American installations thousands of miles away. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. Emperor Hirohito had given his blessing to Operation Hawaii, the codename for the Pearl Harbor attack, after months of careful deliberation by Japan's military leadership. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the plan, understood that Japan's only hope of victory against the United States lay in delivering a crippling blow that would destroy American naval power in the Pacific before it could be fully mobilized. The strategy was audacious in its scope and timing, requiring precise coordination across thousands of miles of ocean. The Japanese task force, known as the Kido Butai, had departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26th, maintaining radio silence as it navigated the treacherous North Pacific waters. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, formed the striking force, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded this formidable fleet, though he harbored private doubts about the mission's ultimate success. According to declassified documents from the National Archives, American intelligence had detected increased Japanese naval activity, but failed to interpret the signals correctly, leading to the tragic unpreparedness at Pearl Harbor. As the sun climbed higher in the Hawaiian sky, the first wave of Japanese planes approached Oahu's northern shore. Fuchida's voice crackled over the radio. "Tora, Tora, Tora!" The predetermined signal indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. The dive bombers peeled off toward Battleship Row while the torpedo planes skimmed low over the water, their deadly cargo aimed at the heart of America's Pacific Fleet. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was among the first Americans to witness the attack. Standing near the operations center at Ford Island, he watched in disbelief as aircraft with rising sun emblems screamed overhead, their bombs already falling toward the anchored warships. His immediate radio transmission, "Air Raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill," would echo through history as the moment America's peaceful Sunday morning shattered into the chaos of war. The surprise was complete, the execution flawless. Within minutes, the USS Arizona exploded in a massive fireball that could be seen for miles, taking 1,167 sailors and Marines to their deaths. The USS Oklahoma began its slow roll to port, trapping hundreds of men in its overturning hull. As black smoke billowed skyward and the harbor filled with burning oil, the Japanese had achieved their tactical objective. The question that would haunt both nations was whether this brilliant military stroke would ultimately prove to be Japan's greatest strategic blunder. The genesis of Japan's bold strategy lay not in the immediate events of 1941, but in decades of mounting tension between two Pacific powers destined for confrontation. Emperor Meiji's restoration in 1868 had transformed Japan from an isolated feudal society into a modern industrial nation hungry for resources and respect. By the early 20th century, Japan's military leaders recognized that their island nation's survival depended on securing raw materials from the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. General Hideki Tojo, who had become prime minister in October 1941, embodied Japan's militaristic philosophy. His rise to power marked the triumph of the army faction over more moderate voices in the Japanese government. Tojo and his supporters believed that Japan's destiny lay in creating the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vast empire stretching from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands. This vision, however, put Japan on a collision course with the United States, Britain, and other Western powers. The American oil embargo imposed in July 1941 served as the catalyst that transformed Japanese strategic thinking from cautious expansion to desperate gamble. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration had responded to Japan's invasion of French Indochina by freezing Japanese assets and cutting off oil exports. This economic strangulation meant that Japan's military machine would grind to a halt within 18 months unless alternative sources of petroleum could be secured. The Dutch East Indies possessed the oil Japan needed, but seizing those territories would inevitably bring America into the war. Admiral Yamamoto, paradoxically one of Japan's most Western-educated military leaders, understood better than most the industrial might of the United States. Having studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, he possessed intimate knowledge of American productive capacity. "I can run wild for 6 months," he reportedly told his colleagues. "After that, I have no expectation of success." His plan for Pearl Harbor emerged from this stark assessment of Japan's strategic position. The attack plan itself represented a masterpiece of military planning and deception. Japanese intelligence had spent months studying American naval routines, identifying the patterns that would maximize the likelihood of finding the Pacific Fleet concentrated in Pearl Harbor. The choice of Sunday morning reflected meticulous analysis of American customs and military procedures. The Japanese correctly calculated that many officers would be ashore, that watch crews would be minimal, and that the element of surprise would be complete. Historical records from the Japanese Defense Ministry, declassified in the 1970s, reveal the extensive planning that went into Operation Hawaii, including detailed scale models of Pearl Harbor used for pilot training. The diplomatic dimension of Japan's strategy added another layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu continued their negotiations with Secretary of State Cordell Hull even as the attack fleet steamed toward Hawaii. This diplomatic charade was designed to maintain the element of surprise, while providing Japan with a thin veneer of legitimacy for its actions. The famous 14-part message that was to be delivered to Hull before the attack began was deliberately delayed, ensuring that the first bombs would fall before any formal declaration of war. The human cost of this strategic chess game was measured not just in ships and planes, but in the lives of thousands of young men who would never see another sunrise. Seaman First Class James Ward aboard the USS Oklahoma was writing a letter to his sweetheart in Iowa when the first torpedo struck. Aviation machinist's mate, First Class John Finn at Kaneohe Bay, grabbed a machine gun and continued firing at Japanese planes despite multiple wounds. These individual acts of courage and sacrifice would be repeated countless times as America's peaceful Sunday morning transformed into a crucible of war. As the second wave of Japanese aircraft approached Pearl Harbor, the success of Yamamoto's gambit seemed assured. The Pacific Fleet lay in ruins, smoke blackened the Hawaiian sky, and America's naval power in the Pacific had been dealt a seemingly mortal blow. Yet the architect of this tactical masterpiece already sensed that his brilliant victory might ultimately seal Japan's doom. The flames still danced across Pearl Harbor's oil-slicked waters when the true magnitude of Japan's strategic miscalculation began to emerge. Admiral Yamamoto's tactical triumph had awakened what he himself called a sleeping giant, transforming the United States from a reluctant observer of global conflict into a fully committed combatant. The attack that was designed to cripple American naval power had instead galvanized the American people with a unity of purpose not seen since the Civil War. President Roosevelt's address to Congress on December 8, 1941, crystallized the nation's resolve. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The president's words resonated across a nation that had been deeply divided about involvement in the global conflict. Isolationists who had argued against American intervention found themselves supporting a declaration of war that passed with only one dissenting vote in both houses of Congress. The Japanese had achieved their immediate tactical objectives with devastating efficiency. 18 American warships had been sunk or damaged, including 8 battleships that formed the backbone of the Pacific Fleet. 188 aircraft had been destroyed, most caught on the ground before they could mount any effective defense. The human toll was equally staggering: 2,403 Americans killed and 1,178 wounded in less than 2 hours of combat. Yet the attack's limitations would prove as significant as its successes. The Japanese had failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities, which contained millions of gallons of oil essential for fleet operations. The Naval Yard's repair facilities remained largely intact, allowing damaged ships to be restored, to service far more quickly than Japanese planners had anticipated. Most critically, the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had been at sea during the attack, preserving the naval aviation assets that would prove decisive in the coming conflict. According to the official U.S. Navy history, the rising sun in the Pacific, the failure to destroy Pearl Harbor's infrastructure, represented a critical oversight in Japanese planning that would have long-term strategic consequences. Captain Mervyn Bennion, commanding officer of the USS West Virginia, exemplified the American response to the surprise attack. Mortally wounded by shrapnel from the first wave of bombers, he remained at his post directing damage control efforts until his death. His final words, reportedly counterattack, would become symbolic of America's transformation from victim to aggressor. Similar acts of heroism occurred throughout the harbor as American sailors and Marines rallied from the initial shock to mount whatever resistance they could. The Japanese pilots who participated in the attack returned to their carriers with mixed emotions about their mission's success. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, who led the second wave of bombers, reported to Admiral Nagumo that American resistance had been minimal and that the attack objectives had been achieved. However, several pilots advocated for a third strike to complete the destruction of Pearl Harbor's facilities. Nagumo's decision to withdraw the task force after 2 waves would be debated by military historians for decades. The psychological impact of the Pearl Harbor attack extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The Japanese had violated fundamental American expectations about how warfare should be conducted. The attack came without warning, on a Sunday morning, against a nation that was not officially at war. This perceived treachery transformed American public opinion overnight, creating a reservoir of anger and determination that would sustain the war effort through 4 years of brutal Pacific combat. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American forces in the Philippines, received word of the Pearl Harbor attack while dealing with his own crisis. Japanese forces had begun their assault on Luzon, catching MacArthur's aircraft on the ground in a repetition of the Hawaii disaster. The simultaneous attacks on American positions across the Pacific revealed the scope of Japanese strategic planning and the magnitude of the challenge facing the United States. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would soon replace Admiral Kimmel as commander of the Pacific Fleet, arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941. Surveying the destruction, he made a prescient observation. The Japanese made 3 of the biggest mistakes an attack force could make, or God was taking care of America. They came in daylight, they came only once, and they came when our carriers were not home. These words would prove prophetic as America began its long journey back across the Pacific. The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor revealed both the devastating effectiveness of Japan's surprise attack and the resilience of American naval power. As rescue crews worked frantically to save trapped sailors from the overturned USS Oklahoma, the scope of the disaster became clear. The battleship Arizona, broken in half by a massive explosion, had become a tomb for over 1,000 men. The war of California, Nevada, and West Virginia settled into the harbor mud, their superstructures barely visible above the oil-stained water. Admiral Husband Kimmel faced the immediate crisis of assessing what remained of his fleet while simultaneously preparing for a potential Japanese invasion of Hawaii. Intelligence reports suggested that the Pearl Harbor attack might be only the first phase of a larger Japanese operation designed to capture the Hawaiian Islands. The loss of 8 battleships had eliminated the Pacific Fleet's primary striking force, leaving only the submarines and the absent aircraft carriers to defend America's Pacific approaches. The Japanese task force, meanwhile, had begun its withdrawal toward home waters, their mission accomplished with remarkable efficiency. Admiral Nagumo's decision to cancel the planned third wave of attacks would be scrutinized for generations. The undamaged fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor contained 4.5 million barrels of oil, enough to cripple American naval operations for months if destroyed. The naval yard's machine shops, dry docks, and repair facilities had also survived largely intact, allowing the Americans to begin immediate salvage operations. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Pearl Harbor's principal planners, had argued for the third strike, recognizing that the attack's strategic value lay not just in sinking ships, but in destroying America's capacity to wage war in the Pacific. His prescient analysis would prove correct, as American engineers began the seemingly impossible task of raising and repairing the damaged battleships. The Nevada, California, and West Virginia would all return to service, testimony to American industrial capability and determination. Navy Department records, released under the Freedom of Information Act, document the extraordinary salvage operations that returned most of the Pearl Harbor casualties to active service within 2 years. The human dimension of the Pearl Harbor tragedy extended beyond the immediate casualties to encompass the families and communities that had lost sons, fathers, and brothers in the attack. 19-year-old Seaman First Class Calvin Graham, who had lied about his age to enlist, survived the attack on the USS Oklahoma, but remained trapped in the overturned hull for 36 hours. His rescue became symbolic of America's determination to save every possible life from the disaster. The Japanese achieved their tactical objectives with precision that impressed even their enemies. The attack demonstrated the effectiveness of carrier-based aviation and the vulnerability of traditional, battleship-centered naval strategies. The success of the Pearl Harbor raid would influence Japanese strategic thinking throughout the early months of the Pacific War, encouraging increasingly ambitious operations that would ultimately stretch their forces beyond sustainable limits. President Roosevelt's war message to Congress captured the national mood of determination mixed with outrage. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. The president's words reflected not just political rhetoric, but a fundamental transformation. In American strategic thinking, the United States would no longer be content with defensive measures, but would pursue total victory over the Axis powers. The attack's timing proved particularly significant for American war planning. The assault came at a moment when American industrial production was already beginning to shift toward military purposes in support of Britain and the Soviet Union. The Pearl Harbor attack accelerated this transformation, unleashing the full, productive capacity of American industry. Within months, shipyards that had been producing merchant vessels were laying down the keels of aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines. That would not end until Japanese cities lay in ruins, and Emperor Hirohito announced his nation's surrender. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, privately acknowledged his growing doubts about Japan's prospects as reports of American mobilization reached Tokyo. The attack that was designed to end the war before it began had instead committed Japan to a prolonged conflict with the world's most powerful industrial nation. The weeks following Pearl Harbor witnessed a fundamental transformation in American strategic thinking and military capacity. The attack had eliminated the Pacific Fleet's battle line, but it had also liberated American naval doctrine from the constraints of battleship-centered warfare. Admiral Ernest King, who assumed command of the U.S. Navy in December 1941, immediately began planning for a new kind of naval war based on aircraft carriers, submarines, and amphibious operations. The first American counterstrike came sooner than anyone had anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's bombing raid on Tokyo, launched from the aircraft carrier Hornet on April 18, 1942, demonstrated that Japan's homeland was not invulnerable to American attack. The raid inflicted minimal physical damage, but delivered a devastating psychological blow to Japanese morale and strategic confidence. Emperor Hirohito's advisors had assured him that the sacred soil of Japan could never be touched by enemy bombs. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 marked the first major naval engagement between American and Japanese forces since Pearl Harbor. The battle was fought entirely by aircraft, with the opposing fleets never coming within sight of each other. The USS Lexington was lost, but the Japanese suffered their first major tactical defeat when the invasion force bound for Port Moresby was turned back. More significantly, the battle demonstrated that American naval aviation could match Japanese pilots in combat effectiveness. Admiral Nimitz, now commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, had spent the months following the attack rebuilding American naval strength through a combination of salvage operations, new construction, and strategic innovation. The Nevada, raised from the harbor mud and extensively rebuilt, rejoined the fleet as a more powerful warship than she had been before the attack. This phoenix-like resurrection of American naval power would become a recurring theme in the Pacific War. The decisive confrontation came at Midway on June 4 through 7, 1942. Admiral Yamamoto had conceived the Midway operation as a means of forcing the remnants of the Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle that would complete the destruction begun at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese assembled the largest naval force in history, including 4 of the aircraft carriers that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu carried the veteran pilots who had achieved such devastating success 6 months earlier. According to Gordon Prange's definitive account, Miracle at Midway, American codebreakers had provided Admiral Nimitz with detailed intelligence about Japanese plans, allowing him to position his forces for maximum advantage. The Battle of Midway became the turning point of the Pacific War. In a single day, the Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers and many of their most experienced pilots. The Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, was transformed from a symbol of Japanese naval supremacy into a blazing wreck. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave of attacks on Pearl Harbor, lay wounded in the Akagi's sickbay as his ship died around him. The irony was not lost on the American pilots who pressed home their attacks. They were avenging Pearl Harbor with interest. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the Japanese carriers just as they were most vulnerable, with their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. His attack on the Akagi began the destruction of the Japanese carrier force, turning Yamamoto's carefully planned offensive into a disaster of unprecedented proportions. The admiral who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor watched helplessly as his strategic vision collapsed in the space of a few hours. The psychological impact of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. The Japanese public had been told that their navy was invincible, that the attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled American naval power permanently. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots revealed the hollowness of these propaganda claims. American industrial production was beginning to reach wartime levels. Launching new aircraft carriers faster than Japan could replace its losses. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from his wounds in a Japanese hospital, reflected on the transformation that had occurred since his triumphant return from Pearl Harbor. The easy victory that was supposed to force American acceptance of Japanese dominance in the Pacific had instead unleashed a war of unprecedented scale and intensity. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared to awaken was now fully aroused and advancing inexorably across the Pacific toward Japan itself. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to the United States. The attack that was designed to prevent American interference in Japanese expansion had instead guaranteed that interference would be total and decisive. The road from Pearl Harbor to Midway had taken exactly 6 months, but it had witnessed the complete reversal of naval power in the Pacific. The final reckoning of Japan's Pearl Harbor strategy would not come until August 1945, when the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Emperor Hirohito to announce Japan's surrender. The attack that was designed to secure Japanese dominance over the Pacific had instead initiated a chain of events that led to Japan's total defeat and occupation. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction that he could run wild for 6 months proved remarkably accurate, but his inability to force American acceptance of Japanese hegemony doomed his nation to catastrophic defeat. The transformation of American military power between December 7, 1941 and September 2, 1945 demonstrated the industrial and technological superiority that Japanese leaders had hoped to neutralize through surprise attack. The Pacific Fleet that had been crippled at Pearl Harbor grew into the most powerful naval force in history. By war's end, the United States Navy operated 15 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, and over 100 escort carriers, supported by a vast array of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. The human cost of Japan's strategic gamble was measured in millions of lives lost across the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor had killed 2,403 Americans, but the war it initiated would claim the lives of over 400,000 American servicemen and perhaps 20 million Japanese, Chinese, and other Asian peoples. The surprise attack that was intended to limit the scope of conflict had instead unleashed the most destructive war in human history. General Douglas MacArthur, accepting the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, reflected on the journey from Pearl Harbor to victory. The battleship Missouri had been constructed in response to the Pearl Harbor attack, representing American industrial might translated into naval power. The ceremony took place in the shadow of Mount Fuji, visible in the distance as a reminder of how far American forces had traveled from that Sunday morning in Hawaii. The official surrender ceremony, documented in the Army Signal Corps film The Fleet That Came to Stay, symbolized the complete reversal of fortune that had occurred since Pearl Harbor. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate military results. The attack transformed American foreign policy from isolationism to global engagement, establishing the United States as the dominant world power. The industrial mobilization triggered by Pearl Harbor created the economic foundation for American supremacy that would last for decades. The scientific and technological innovations developed during the war, culminating in the atomic bomb, gave America military capabilities that dwarfed those of any potential rival. Admiral Nimitz, speaking at the Pearl Harbor Memorial Service in 1962, captured the paradox of Japan's attack. The Japanese made a tactical success and a strategic failure. They achieved complete surprise and inflicted devastating damage, but they failed to destroy our will to fight. Instead, they united our nation and unleashed our full potential. The Admiral's words reflected the judgment of history on one of the most consequential military decisions of the 20th century. The individual stories of heroism and sacrifice that emerged from Pearl Harbor became part of American national mythology. Doris Miller, a mess attendant aboard the USS West Virginia, manned an anti-aircraft gun despite having no training on the weapon, becoming the first African American to receive the Navy Cross. His courage under fire represented the democratic ideals that America was fighting to defend. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who survived the war and became a Christian missionary, spent his later years reflecting on the attack he had led. In his memoirs, he acknowledged that Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic disaster. "We awakened a sleeping giant," he wrote, echoing his former commander's famous words. "We should have known that America would never accept defeat." The attack on Pearl Harbor had been conceived as a surgical strike that would remove American naval power from the Pacific equation, allowing Japan to consolidate its empire without interference. Instead, it became the catalyst for a global conflict that ended with American forces occupying Japan itself. The surprise attack that was designed to prevent American involvement in Asia had instead made that involvement total and permanent. The memory of Pearl Harbor continued to shape American strategic thinking long after the war's end. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" became synonymous with the need for military preparedness and the dangers of strategic surprise. The attack demonstrated that geography alone could not protect America from its enemies, leading to the global military commitments that characterized the Cold War era. As the sun set over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Japanese task force was already steaming toward home waters, its mission accomplished with devastating efficiency. The tactical success was complete, but the strategic consequences were already beyond Japanese control. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its wrath would not be satisfied until the rising sun flag was lowered forever over the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay.